A cold hall, harsh lights, rows of uniforms, and a leader choosing to add a new enemy while his old war is already slipping toward winter. Across the ocean, Americans are still counting the wreckage at Pearl Harbor, assuming the fight will stay in the Pacific for now. In Europe, Britain is hanging on, the Atlantic is a knife fight, and Germany is locked in a vast campaign against the Soviet Union that is no longer moving the way it did in summer. The prevailing assumption, quiet but powerful, is that Berlin will avoid pulling the United States directly into the European war, at least until Germany can finish what it started in the East. And then, on December 11, 1941, Hitler breaks that assumption in public. He declares war on the United States, by choice, not necessity, turning a regional shock into a global system. The mystery is not that war expanded. The mystery is why Hitler chose the timing, why he believed the trade was worth it, and what he thought he was buying in the Atlantic and in the alliance with Japan. Because once a great power makes a declaration like that, history stops being reversible. So join Rooms Where History as we trace the decision that pulled American powers straight into Europe, how it happened, what it unlocked, and what it cost. December 11, 1941. Berlin is the stage, and the decision is no longer private. Hitler frames the United States as already acting like a belligerent, then formalizes the break. Germany is now in a state of war with America. The critical point is that this is not a defensive reflex forced by treaty language. The Tripartite Pact promised support if one partner was attacked by a power not already in the war, but Pearl Harbor was Japan striking first, not Japan being attacked. That meant Hitler still had a choice: keep the conflict compartmentalized or widen it deliberately. Widening it brought immediate clarity. It removed ambiguity for German naval strategy, made alliance rhetoric real, and dared Washington to respond. But it also erased the last political space for the United States to remain half in. In Washington, the decision forced a clean answer. Congress declares war on Germany and Italy within hours, and the European war becomes America's war too. That moment is the hinge. The question is what pressures made Hitler treat that hinge as an advantage. To understand the gamble, step back to 1939. Germany's initial strategic aim was not simply conquest, it was sequencing. Fight wars one at a time, isolate opponents, and keep the strongest industrial power, the United States, out of direct combat as long as possible. Early on, that looked plausible. The U.S. public had vivid memories of the First World War and strong political resistance to another European entanglement. But Roosevelt's administration also understood something structural. In modern industrial war, neutrality is rarely stable. If Britain fell, the Atlantic balance would shift toward Germany, and the United States would face a hostile, heavily armed coastline across the ocean. That fear pushed Washington toward incremental involvement, aid without a formal declaration, escort without open battle, pressure without the label of war. Each step was calibrated to domestic politics, but each step also narrowed the space for Berlin to pretend the United States was irrelevant. And that narrowing space matters because Hitler's December decision did not come from a vacuum. It came from a system already drifting toward collision, one convoy and one incident at a time. In that system, the Atlantic is the central mechanism. Germany cannot easily invade Britain without sea control, so it tries to starve Britain instead. That makes submarines, Dönitz's U-boats, strategic instruments, not just weapons. The logic is brutal. Sink merchant tonnage faster than Britain can replace it, and Britain's war effort breaks. But submarines require freedom of action, and freedom of action depends on political boundaries. Before America enters the war, U-boats must manage risk, misidentification, diplomatic backlash, and the possibility that an incident pulls the United States in sooner than Berlin wants. Meanwhile, Washington watches the same ocean and draws the opposite conclusion. If the Atlantic becomes a German lake, American security becomes a gamble. So the contest turns into a pressure contest. Germany wants fear without triggering intervention. America wants influence without an official war. That is what people later called an undeclared naval war, a slow escalation where the label lags behind the reality. And once that reality exists, leaders start to treat formal declarations as paperwork catching up to facts. By 1940, after France falls, the strategic picture sharpens. Britain is isolated, and the question becomes whether Britain can be sustained. Roosevelt answers with industrial policy and political messaging. The United States will become the arsenal that keeps Britain in the war. Lend-Lease, announced and enacted in 1941, turns production into power projection without a formal declaration. From Berlin's perspective, this is not neutral. It is adversarial support feeding the enemy's endurance. Yet Hitler still tries to manage timing. The war in Europe is moving fast, and he expects that a decisive campaign, especially against the Soviet Union, can be completed before American force truly arrives. In that expectation is a major strategic bet: that industrial mass cannot translate into battlefield mass quickly enough to matter. But industrial mobilization is not just about soldiers. It is about ships, escorts, aircraft, fuel logistics, and the capacity to replace losses. Each Liberty ship laid down is an argument that the Atlantic chokehold may fail. That is the constraint stack building under Hitler's feet. The longer the war lasts, the more American production becomes destiny. Here is the quiet moment that often gets missed. Leaders do not escalate in one leap. They escalate while persuading themselves they are still controlling it. In Washington, Roosevelt has to manage a public that is not uniformly ready for a European war. So he speaks in the language of defense, hemisphere security, protection of shipping lanes, deterrence of piracy. The strategy is incremental commitment. Escort convoys farther, share intelligence more deeply, position U.S. naval power as a shield, not a sword. Each step keeps the political center intact, but it also sends Berlin a signal. American involvement is growing, and it is being normalized. In Berlin, that normalization is interpreted through ideology and suspicion. Hitler's worldview paints the United States as a capitalist rival destined to clash with Germany anyway. That belief can become self-fulfilling because it turns each American move from a limited policy into proof of a looming inevitability. So, the diplomatic space shrinks from both sides. And when space shrinks, a single shock, like an incident at sea, can flip the system from drift to rupture. Then the incidents arrive, and they carry numbers, bodies, and headlines. In early September 1941, the USS Greer encounters a German submarine in the North Atlantic, and Roosevelt uses the episode to announce a more aggressive escort posture, what becomes known as shoot on sight. In October, the destroyer USS Kearney is torpedoed while escorting a convoy, killing American sailors. By the end of that month, USS Reuben James is sunk with heavy loss of life, before the United States has officially declared war. From Hitler's side, these are provocations, evidence that the United States is already fighting in everything but name. From Roosevelt's side, they are proof that the Atlantic fight is already at America's doorstep. each side is collecting facts that justify escalation. This is the key. By late 1941, Hitler can plausibly tell himself that a formal declaration does not start anything new. It merely recognizes the conflict that already exists. That belief lowers the perceived cost of widening the war, and it makes December's decision feel like a choice between clarity and illusion, not between peace and war. Now layer in the decision-maker. Hitler is not a neutral calculator. He is ideological, risk-tolerant, and deeply confident in his own reading of willpower. That matters because strategic trade-offs often turn on beliefs about the opponent, and Hitler holds two beliefs that push him toward escalation. First, he sees the United States as internally divided, big, rich, and slow. He expects political conflict, bureaucratic friction, and the challenge of fighting across oceans to delay effective power. Second, he believes that Germany's enemies can be broken psychologically if they are forced into too many theaters at once. If the United States is tied down in the Pacific against Japan, Hitler assumes American pressure in Europe will be limited, or at least delayed long enough for Germany to finish its decisive operations. Those beliefs are not merely opinions. They are the assumptions that make the December choice appear rational inside Hitler's head. If you believe America cannot fully mobilize in time, then declaring war is not suicidal. It is an attempt to control the order of battles. But those beliefs also hide the danger. Because when you misread industrial capacity and alliance coordination, you do not just make an error. You invite a system-wide correction that you cannot later undo. While the Atlantic simmers, the Eastern Front explodes. In June 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. The early months are catastrophic for Moscow, and they feed Hitler's confidence. The campaign appears to validate his instinct for bold timing. But by late autumn, the system changes. Distances grow, supply lines stretch, losses mount, and the weather turns. The war that was supposed to end quickly begins to look like a war of endurance. Endurance is exactly what Hitler wants to avoid, because endurance favors mass production and coalition power, fields where the United States is uniquely dangerous. This is where December becomes psychologically legible. As Germany's rapid victory stalls, Hitler needs a strategic narrative that restores momentum, not necessarily on the battlefield, but in alliance cohesion and maritime pressure. Declaring war on the United States can be framed as seizing initiative, choosing the enemy rather than being chosen, expanding the battlefield in a way that supposedly unlocks German naval potential and binds Japan closer. It is a form of strategic theater meant to compensate for operational drag in the East. And once the Eastern Front becomes a winter war, Hitler's temptation grows. If you cannot quickly win one war, you try to rearrange all wars so they become winnable. To see the full trade, you have to include Tokyo, not as background, but as a strategic variable. Japan's leadership is pursuing its own objectives: resources, security, regional dominance, and freedom of action in Asia. The alliance with Germany is real, but it is not command and control. Coordination is limited by distance, secrecy, and divergent priorities. That matters because Hitler's December choice assumes benefits from Japanese action. If Japan ties down the United States in the Pacific, Germany gets time. If Japan expands fast enough, America's strategic focus fragments. If Japan threatens Soviet territory, pressure on Germany's Eastern Front might ease. But those are hopes, not guarantees. And hopes become dangerous when they replace verified mechanisms. Alliances are not magic. They are incentives. Japan will fight where Japan's incentives point. Germany will fight where Germany's incentives point. When incentives align, coalitions look inevitable. When they don't, coalitions become parallel wars that drain each other's assumptions. So when Pearl Harbor happens, it is not simply a shock. It is a fork. It offers Hitler a chance to bind the alliance tighter, or to keep strategic distance and let Japan absorb America's fury alone. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor is attacked, and the Pacific War begins in full view. Roosevelt addresses Congress the next day, and the United States declares war on Japan. In Berlin, the event is watched through the lens of opportunity. The United States is now forced into open conflict, and its public is unified by shock. At first glance, that unity should have warned Hitler. A unified America is the opposite of a slow America. But Hitler interprets the moment differently. He sees a strategic opening to define the war on his terms. If America is already mobilizing, then Germany should choose the moment of confrontation, not wait for America to choose it. This is also where ideology and propaganda become tools of strategy. A formal declaration can rally domestic support, frame the conflict as defensive against a hostile system, and portray Germany as standing with its ally Japan. In authoritarian systems, the boundary between strategic calculation and political theater is thin. Leaders often treat dramatic announcements as a way to force reality to follow narrative. But narratives do not build ships. Narratives do not replace escorts. Narratives do not shorten supply lines. They can buy time in public opinion, but they can also trigger concrete responses abroad. And the concrete response waiting in Washington is industrial mobilization at scale. Now put Hitler back into the decision corridor, because this is where trade-offs become real. After Pearl Harbor, his options are not infinite. Option 1. Do not declare war and keep the U.S. formally focused on Japan while Germany continues its Atlantic campaign under a political fog. Option 2. Declare war, gain clarity for naval operations, and tighten the Axis posture, at the price of bringing the United States officially into the European war. Option 3. Wait. Delay the decision. See how Washington reacts, and preserve flexibility. Waiting sounds cautious, but it has costs. It risks looking unreliable to Japan. It risks losing the initiative in messaging, and it risks allowing Roosevelt to shape American strategy without Germany naming itself as the central enemy. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, German naval leadership wants fewer restraints. If the United States is already escorting, already exchanging intelligence, already fighting in practice, then keeping the legal fiction begins to feel pointless. This is the heart of Hitler's gamble. He treats the declaration as a tool to simplify a complex strategic environment. Simplification can be powerful, if your simplified picture is true. If it isn't, simplification becomes a trap that locks you into the worst-case version of your own assumptions. There is also a psychological mechanism at work. Leaders often prefer decisions that feel like control. A formal declaration is clean, it is legible, it is decisive. It turns a messy gray war into a black and white alignment that can be explained at home and exploited at sea. But the gray zone had been strategically useful. As long as the United States was not formally at war with Germany, Roosevelt had to balance priorities, justify incremental steps, and manage competing domestic factions. That friction limited how quickly America could coordinate a full transatlantic mobilization. In other words, the gray zone slowed the system down. By declaring war, Hitler removes that friction on the assumption that America's speed does not matter yet. That is the trade: immediate operational clarity and alliance theater bought by sacrificing the opponent's political hesitation. It is a classic strategic exchange. You give up ambiguity in order to gain short-term freedom of action. The danger is that ambiguity is not just confusion. In geopolitics, ambiguity is sometimes leverage. It allows you to delay a stronger opponent's full activation. When you remove it, you are telling the opponent, "Stop arguing, start building." And America is very good at building. So the mechanism moves from intent to execution. In Berlin, the declaration is formalized through government channels and then amplified by Hitler's public address. In Washington, Germany's diplomatic representative communicates that Germany considers itself in a state of war with the United States. The process is deliberate, not a battlefield accident, but a political act with legal consequences. The immediate payoff for Hitler is the story he can tell. Germany is no longer reacting to American moves. It is openly confronting a new enemy. The immediate cost is just as fast. Roosevelt's strategic problem is simplified overnight. America is now at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. There is no longer a need to pretend. Congress responds, and the U.S. state apparatus pivots toward full-spectrum mobilization. In London, Churchill reads the situation with relief. Britain is no longer alone waiting for a hesitant partner. The coalition becomes explicit, and coalition war is not just about troops. It is about combined planning, shared intelligence, coordinated shipping, and unified industrial output. This is the paradox of Hitler's move. He declares war to gain freedom in the Atlantic, but he also creates the political conditions for the Atlantic to become a combined Allied system, organized, resourced, and relentless. If you measure only the short-term operational effects, you can see why Hitler believed the declaration might pay. Submarine warfare thrives when rules loosen and hesitation disappears. German naval planners anticipate opportunities along American shipping lanes, especially if the U.S. coastline is not yet fully defended, convoyed, and blacked out. In early 1942, U-boat operations off the American coast achieve alarming successes precisely because defensive systems are still catching up. That is the temptation of many strategic gambles. The first returns can look like validation. Early sinkings can be counted. Headlines can be harvested. A sense of momentum can be manufactured. And for leaders under pressure, especially leaders confronting winter setbacks, momentum is political oxygen. But submarine war is a contest of adaptation. The advantage is rarely permanent. The side with greater industrial depth, better code-breaking coordination, more escort capacity, and stronger shipbuilding tends to learn faster and recover faster. So the operational payoff has a clock on it, which means Hitler's true calculation cannot be judged by what happens first. It must be judged by what happens after the opponent's system fully awakens. That is where the decision's cost grows heavier. Now look at Washington's side of the equation, because the declaration does something Roosevelt could not do as cleanly before. It collapses the argument. Before December 11, Roosevelt could push the U.S. closer to conflict through escorts and aid, but he still had to justify why America should fight Germany directly. After December 11, Germany answers that question for him. This matters for strategy because it affects prioritization. America is now fighting in two oceans, but it can choose which enemy must be defeated first. Coalition planning soon converges on a Germany-first strategic emphasis, not because the Pacific is unimportant, but because Germany's position in Europe is seen as the central threat to the global balance. That strategic emphasis has consequences for resources. Escort production, shipbuilding priorities, aircraft allocation, and long-range planning for a European ground war. The declaration does not instantly put American soldiers in Berlin, but it sets the American machine onto a track that leads there, step by step, convoy by convoy, contract by contract. Hitler's decision, meant to simplify Germany's maritime fight, ends up simplifying America's strategic argument. And in grand strategy, the side that can simplify its political logic while expanding its industrial output is often the side that wins endurance wars. Here is the pressure spike that makes the trade-off unmistakable. Once the United States is formally at war with Germany, America's industrial mobilization is no longer just support, it becomes replacement. Replacement for ships sunk, for equipment consumed, for losses absorbed, for allies stretched thin. And replacement at American scale changes the mathematics of attrition. Hitler's system is built for rapid, decisive campaigns. It is less suited to a long contest of tonnage and fuel. Germany's choices in 1941, expanding theaters, sustaining the Eastern Front, maintaining the Atlantic Battle, already strain resources. Adding a fully activated American opponent does not just add another enemy, it adds an enemy with the capacity to convert time into force. In the short run, Hitler may believe the United States will be trapped by distance. In the medium run, distance becomes logistics, and logistics become shipyards. The more the war becomes about moving men and materials across oceans, the more an industrial maritime power gains advantage. This is why December 11 matters beyond symbolism. It is the moment Hitler transforms a dangerous drift into a direct contest against the strongest industrial actor on the planet, while still fighting a massive land war in the East. So, what did Hitler think he was buying? One answer is alliance cohesion. The Tripartite Pact is not just legal text, it is psychology. Hitler wants Japan to feel Germany is fully committed, and he wants the world to see a united Axis front. That perception might deter smaller states, stiffen Italian morale, and complicate Allied diplomacy. Another answer is operational latitude. If the United States is now openly an enemy, German naval warfare can be pushed harder without the same concern for incidents. From a narrow military lens, the declaration reduces constraints. But the deepest purchase is strategic timing. Hitler's ideal timeline is simple. Japan occupies American attention in the Pacific, Germany stabilizes or wins in the East, Britain weakens under U-boat pressure, and the United States arrives too late to change the European outcome. In that imagined timeline, declaring war is not reckless. It is synchronized escalation, turning separate fights into a coordinated squeeze. The problem is that synchronization requires real coordination, not just parallel pressure. And the Axis does not have a unified command capable of directing Japan's strategy toward Germany's needs. So Hitler is effectively wagering on alignment that he cannot enforce. That is a gamble disguised as confidence. There is also a quieter, more personal layer to decision-making at the top. Leaders make choices under narrative pressure. By late 1941, Hitler's image as an unstoppable strategist is under stress. The Soviet campaign is not ending quickly. The United States is becoming more involved. Britain is still standing. In such moments, dramatic decisions can serve an internal function. They restore the leader's sense of agency. They create a new storyline that avoids admitting the old plan is failing. Declaring war can be packaged as boldness rather than overreach. It can redirect public attention from stalled fronts to world historical confrontation. This matters because it shows how strategic logic can be contaminated by psychological needs. The trade-offs become distorted. Costs that should dominate, industrial imbalance, coalition response, long war risk, can be treated as abstract. Benefits that are immediate, clarity, momentum, alliance theater, can feel concrete and therefore more attractive. None of this requires invented meetings or secret quotes. It is a structural reality of authoritarian war leadership. When one person's judgment is central, the boundary between strategy and self-image is thin. And when that boundary thins, the war itself becomes a stage for choices that outgrow their original logic. From the Allied perspective, Hitler's declaration is a gift of clarity. It aligns legal authority, public sentiment, and strategic planning. Britain and the United States can now coordinate openly without diplomatic theater. The Atlantic becomes not just a battlefield, but a supply artery protected by joint commitment. For Germany, the declaration creates a second-order problem. It forces the enemy coalition to solve its coordination problem sooner. Coalitions always struggle with priorities: who gets ships, who gets aircraft, which front gets resources. Formal war compresses those debates, and once the Allies decide that Germany is the primary threat, the coalition's industrial and naval focus begins to converge. Second-order effects are where great power decisions often become irreversible. Hitler may have sought to increase pressure through submarine war, but the Allied answer is to increase escort production, tighten convoy systems, expand anti-sub patrols, and pour industrial mass into the Atlantic pipeline. That response does not happen in 1 week, but once initiated, it becomes a machine that keeps accelerating. This is the moment the decision stops being a single act and becomes a chain reaction. A declaration is a switch. After the switch flips, the system's inertia does the rest. Now, ask the hardest analytical question. Was Hitler avoiding the inevitable or accelerating it? By late 1941, the United States is already deeply entangled, escorting convoys, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union, fighting incidents at sea. Many historians argue the collision was coming regardless because the strategic interests were already opposed. But timing still matters. If Hitler had not declared war, Roosevelt would still be fighting Japan, an enormous war that consumes carriers, aircraft, and public attention. The domestic politics of adding a European declaration might have taken longer to resolve, even if it eventually resolved. Delay can be strategic value. It buys time. It creates friction. It complicates planning. By declaring war, Hitler removes the need for Roosevelt to persuade skeptics. He turns what might have been a gradual escalation into a clean, legal state. In doing so, he may have traded away Germany's best remaining advantage against the United States: time before full activation. This is why December 11th is remembered as more than symbolism. It is an acceleration event. It shortens the pathway between American industry and European battlefields. And in a war of endurance, shortening that pathway is rarely a gift you can afford to give. Let's isolate what the decision achieved in the short term, without moralizing. First, it aligned Germany's political posture with the operational reality of Atlantic confrontation. Second, it aimed to reinforce Axis solidarity at a moment when coalition credibility mattered. Third, it created a narrative of initiative, Germany choosing to confront a global opponent rather than being cornered into reaction. Those are real, identifiable benefits, but they are benefits that live mostly in the realm of posture and near-term operational latitude. They do not resolve Germany's underlying constraint stack, a widening resource gap, a multi-front land war, and a naval war whose success depends on outlasting the opponent's adaptation. Short-term benefits are seductive because they are visible quickly. You can point to them. You can broadcast them. You can use them to rally support. Long-term costs are harder to see because they unfold through systems. Shipbuilding programs, training pipelines, convoy doctrine, alliance committees. The long-term costs often look like background until they suddenly become unstoppable. That mismatch between visible benefit and invisible cost is the trap that December 11 illustrates. Hitler takes a decision that looks decisive on the day it is announced, but the war's deeper mechanics do not reward dramatic clarity. They reward sustainable power. Now measure the damage and risk created by the same decision. The first damage is strategic. It invites the United States to plan Europe as a central theater. The second is industrial. It signals that American shipbuilding and aircraft production are not just support for others. They are instruments of direct war. The third is diplomatic. It solidifies a global coalition that can coordinate resources and legitimacy more effectively than the Axis can. And then there is the ultimate risk. Germany becomes committed to a long war against opponents whose combined production and manpower can exceed Germany's capacity to replace losses. Even if Germany wins battles, endurance becomes the enemy. This is where the Eastern Front returns as the decisive constraint. Germany's campaign against the Soviet Union is absorbing enormous resources and attention. A rational strategy under such strain would prioritize narrowing adversaries, not widening them. Hitler does the opposite, because he believes widening can create new leverage. That is a gamble rooted in belief, not guarantee. When strategic decisions rest on "the enemy will stay slow," "the ally will do what we need," or "the coalition will not coordinate," you are not managing risk. You are betting against systemic adaptation. And systems adapt, especially when shocked into unity. The price, the explicit trade, can now be stated cleanly. Hitler bought short-term clarity and a posture of alliance unity. He paid with ambiguity, time, and strategic flexibility. He traded away the opponent's political hesitation in exchange for his own operational permission. He traded away the chance to keep the United States legally divided between theaters in exchange for the emotional satisfaction of total confrontation. And because the declaration was public and formal, it also traded away reversibility. You cannot walk back a declaration of war without collapse of credibility. Once said, it becomes a commitment device. It locks in escalation and forces planning on both sides to assume total conflict. That is why this is a rooms where history decision. It is made behind closed doors, but its real power comes from what happens after it leaves the room. The moment it becomes public, it activates institutions. Legislatures, production boards, general staffs, alliance committees, shipping administrations. Those institutions create momentum that outlasts any single leader's intention. In other words, Hitler's decision does not merely add America as an enemy, it triggers America as a system. And systems do not respond in speeches. They respond in output. There is a broader lesson here about strategic leadership. A pivotal decision is rarely a pure calculation. It is calculation inside a personality, inside a political structure, inside a war that is already shaping what options feel available. Hitler's December 11 move sits at the intersection of ideology, operational desire, coalition theater, and the fear of losing momentum. That intersection matters because it explains why obvious in hindsight decisions are not obvious in the moment. In December 1941, Hitler can plausibly believe he is converting drift into control. He can plausibly believe America will be delayed. He can plausibly believe Japan will keep pressure on Washington. He can plausibly believe the Atlantic will be won before American production becomes decisive. What makes the decision historically significant is not that those beliefs existed. It is that the decision treated those beliefs as durable mechanisms rather than fragile assumptions. Great power strategy fails most often when assumptions are promoted into certainty. So the decision becomes a case study in overreach through simplification. When a leader tries to simplify a complex war by expanding it, and in doing so, awakens the very capacity that makes the war unwinnable over time. If you want a single sentence that captures why December 11 changed the global balance, it is this: Hitler chose to fight the United States at the moment when the war was becoming a contest of endurance. That is exactly when American endurance capacity, industrial, financial, maritime, matters most. A state can survive setbacks when it can replace losses. A coalition can survive disagreement when it can coordinate supplies. The Allies, after December 11, moved toward that kind of organized endurance. Germany, already stretched, becomes increasingly dependent on decisive victories that must happen before the opponent's machine reaches full speed. This is why historians treat Hitler's declaration as a strategic turning point, even though it is not a battlefield event. It shifts the war's center of gravity. It transforms the Atlantic from a contested lifeline into a prioritized artery backed by America's production and Britain's experience. And it gives Roosevelt something priceless: unity of purpose that can be sustained publicly, legally, and economically. Hitler's goal was to pressure Britain and restrict America's influence. The result is the opposite. Britain is reinforced, and America's influence becomes formal, planned, and global. That inversion is what makes the decision so consequential. So how should we evaluate the decision? Strategically, not morally. In the very short term, the logic has coherence. If the United States is already acting as an enemy in the Atlantic, formalize it, exploit early openings, and tighten alliance posture. If you believe America will be distracted by Japan and delayed by distance, then a declaration can look like seizing initiative. But strategy is not judged by coherence alone. It is judged by whether your key assumptions survive contact with the opponent's response. And the opponent's response here is not a single battle. It is mobilization. Once the United States is formally in the European war, it can allocate resources, coordinate grand strategy, and build for a long conflict without the political friction of ambiguity. That is a structural change. And structural changes are what reshape wars. This is the core analytical conclusion. Hitler's declaration is a decision that optimizes for clarity and early leverage at the cost of triggering a superior endurance system. It is not merely a mistake in the abstract. It is a trade that becomes unfavorable because the opponent's strengths are precisely the strengths that only appear over time. And that leads to the final hinge. Decisions made in rooms are often made to solve the present. But history punishes decisions that ignore the future's mechanics. Hitler's December 11 decision tries to solve the present: stalled momentum, alliance signaling, Atlantic constraints, by expanding conflict. Yet expansion is not always power. Sometimes expansion is exposure. It exposes your resource limits, your coordination gaps, and your reliance on hopes about what others will do. The enduring value of studying this turning point is not to treat it as a trivia question, "Why did he declare?" but as a framework question. What happens when a leader trades ambiguity for confrontation without owning the full cost of activating a stronger system? That is the story's final tension. The declaration feels like strength because it is loud, formal, and absolute. But strength in modern war is often quiet. Logistics, production, coordination, and endurance. When the loud move awakens the quiet strength of the opponent, the decision's meaning changes. So when you hear December 11th, 1941, do not picture only a speech. Picture a switch being flipped, one that turned American capacity into a European fact. Hitler's declaration of war did achieve something in the short term. It aligned Germany's political posture with a conflict that was already intensifying in the Atlantic, and it projected a sense of initiative at a moment when Germany needed momentum. It also aimed to strengthen the Axis image, Germany standing openly with Japan, while removing the restraints of diplomatic ambiguity for naval warfare. But the same decision damaged Germany's strategic position in ways that only become clear when you think in systems. It pulled the United States, legally, politically, and strategically, into the European war at the moment the conflict was shifting toward endurance. It simplified Roosevelt's argument, accelerated coalition coordination, and activated American industrial power as a direct weapon against the Reich, not merely as distant support. That is the price of the decision. Hitler traded away time, ambiguity, and flexibility, three assets that can delay a stronger opponent's full mobilization, in exchange for short-term clarity and alliance theater. And once the declaration went public, it could not be walked back without admitting collapse. The deeper lesson is analytical, not moral. In high-stakes strategy, the most dangerous moves are often the ones that feel decisive while relying on fragile assumptions. Assumptions that the opponent will stay slow, that allies will align on command, or that geography will keep power at a distance. When those assumptions fail, the decision does not just backfire. It rearranges the entire structure of the conflict against you. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps Rooms Where History reach viewers who care about serious, evidence-minded analysis. Subscribe if you want more calm documentary storytelling about the rooms, the choices, and the consequences that reshaped nations for decades. And I'd like to hear from you. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and which single decision you think most redirected the Second World War. This channel is built for people who value clear cause and effect over slogans. Students, veterans' families, researchers, and anyone who believes history deserves structure, not noise. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting work that treats turning points with the seriousness they require.